The night I watched the police cut the power to my house, I realized Christmas wasn't the only thing they were trying to silence. They were trying to silence me. The December air bit through my coat as blue and red lights washed across my yard, staining the snow in streaks of cold color. I could still hear the faint echo of Silent Night dying mid-chorus when the speakers went dark. For a moment, everything froze. The music, the lights, the breath in my throat. Then came the murmur of my neighbors, their silhouettes standing behind frosted windows, too afraid or too curious to look away. I stood there barefoot on the porch, my hands trembling against the wood railing. The cords of my outdoor speakers hung like severed veins, trailing down into the snow where a uniformed officer had yanked them loose. The smell of burnt wire mixed with pine and cold earth, and all I could think about was how much my husband, Michael, would have hated this, seeing me turned into some kind of criminal for playing holiday music. Every year since he died, I'd kept our tradition alive. Christmas Eve, 7 o'clock sharp, I'd play the songs he loved most. The first Noel, O Holy Night, and the one he used to hum when hanging the lights, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. But this year, the songs didn't even make it past 8. Richard Coleman was already there before the officers arrived. Of course he was. He stood at the edge of my driveway like a conductor ready to cue the orchestra of chaos. He wore his usual navy blazer, his HOA badge clipped neatly on his lapel as if it gave him some kind of authority over joy. His voice, calm but dripping with condescension, floated above the hum of the police radios. "We warned you, Sarah," he said, not loud enough for the cameras but clear enough for me. "You were asked to stop violating community peace. You chose not to." Community peace. That was his favorite phrase, as if happiness itself were an act of rebellion. I wanted to tell him that the community used to be peaceful. Back when the HOA wasn't a dictatorship. Back before he decided that blinking lights and Christmas melodies were a personal offense. But the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, dry, angry. The officer closest to me avoided eye contact as he coiled up the last of my extension cord. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we're just here to enforce a complaint filed by your association." "My association?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "You mean Richard's association?" The officer didn't respond. He just handed me a pink, carbon copy of the noise violation report and walked away toward the patrol car, boots crunching over the ice. I looked down at the slip. Excessive noise after 9 p.m. Reported disturbance. Non-compliance with HOA directive. It wasn't even signed by a city official. Just Richard's neat little signature in black ink. Behind him, my neighbor's lights flickered on one by one. Curtains shifted. I could feel their eyes on me. The woman who loved Christmas too much. The widow who wouldn't let go. The music teacher who dared to make the street feel alive again. Richard turned as if to leave but then paused. "You know," he said, adjusting his coat, "there's a difference between honoring tradition and disturbing order. I suggest you remember that." I stared at him, unable to move. His breath fogged the air between us, his eyes reflecting the dying glow of my half-lit reindeer. For a second, I almost laughed. The absurdity of it all. This man, this self-appointed guardian of silence, declaring war on Christmas music. But the laughter never made it past my chest. The snow began to fall harder, thick flakes clinging to my hair and shoulders. The lights around my porch flickered weakly, running on backup battery power, casting faint shadows across the icicles. I could still hear, faintly, the echo of the last note that had played. A fading violin line, hanging like a ghost in the night air. And in that fading sound, something inside me hardened. I thought about all the years I'd poured myself into this neighborhood. The bake sales, the fundraisers, the music programs for kids whose parents couldn't afford instruments. I thought about how Michael and I had chosen Maple Ridge because it was supposed to feel like family. But standing there in the cold, surrounded by flashing lights and judgmental stares, I realized family doesn't pull your plug when you're down. As the police left and the last cruiser rolled away, I stayed on the porch, the silence thick enough to taste. I ran my hand along the dead speaker cable, still warm from the power it had carried moments ago. Somewhere deep inside, the shame and anger twisted into something new. Resolve. Because this wasn't about volume. It wasn't about music. It was about control. Richard Coleman didn't just want quiet nights. He wanted obedience. And that night, as the snow buried my extension cords and my tears froze on my cheeks, I made myself a promise. If they wanted silence, I'd give them something they'd never forget. Before the night everything fell apart. Life on Maple Ridge Estates had a rhythm that felt almost sacred. You could time your evenings by the laughter of kids sledding near the cul-de-sac or the soft flicker of porch lights at dusk. It was quiet, but alive, a hum of goodness that made you believe people still cared. I loved that hum. I lived for it. After Michael died, that hum became my heartbeat. He'd always said Christmas lights weren't decorations, they were promises. Promises that even in the darkest months, light and warmth could survive. The first Christmas without him, I stood in the cold with tangled wires and tears on my lashes. I almost couldn't do it, but when I plugged in that first strand, the glow felt like him. Not gone, just changed. From that night on, the music and lights became my way of keeping him close. By December 10th, every year, Maple Ridge shimmered like a snow globe. My house wasn't the biggest, but it had heart. Kids would gather out front, cocoa in hand, faces bright with wonder. I'd hand out cookies. The sparkly one was always little Emma's favorite. My best friend and neighbor, Dana Brooks, was always there too, laughing as we wrapped garlands around the porch rail, while her son Ethan passed us clips. We'd stay out too long, drink too much cocoa, and by nightfall, the neighborhood would feel alive again. Then Richard Coleman arrived. When I first met him, he seemed harmless, polite, neat, the kind of man who ironed his jeans. He'd just been elected HOA president after the old board stepped down. He talked about standards and community harmony, reasonable words, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. There was something colder beneath it. The first warning came in whispers. Dana came back from a meeting one night, frowning. "They're talking about making decorations visually uniform," she said. We laughed it off. How could anyone police joy? But the laughter didn't last. By fall, Richard's newsletters arrived, all about seasonal moderation and noise control. Then came the new rules. No displays above a certain wattage, no outdoor music after 8, no ornaments without pre-approval. I remember staring at that list, torn between laughing and crying. "What's next?" Dana said. "Banning happiness?" Still, I didn't believe he'd enforce it. Maple Ridge had always been kind. We watched each other's kids, baked for one another, shared what we had. But that winter, the air felt different. Careful, quieter, like everyone was waiting for something to go wrong. When Dana asked, "You think he'll say something?" As we strung lights that December, I forced a smile. "He can try. Music's how I breathe." I wish I'd known how wrong I was. A week later, on a frozen Tuesday morning, I stepped outside for the paper. The snow glowed under the early sun. For a heartbeat, it all looked peaceful again. The wreath, the lights, the quiet. Then I saw it, a white envelope, taped neatly to my front door, and in that moment, I knew peace had just ended on Maple Ridge. The envelope looked innocent enough, white, clean, perfectly centered on my front door. But the second I saw Richard Coleman's signature in blue ink at the bottom, my stomach turned cold. It wasn't the first time the HOA had sent out reminders about trash bins or lawn trimming, but this one felt heavier, like a threat dressed up in politeness. The paper even smelled like cheap cologne and printer toner, a mix that made my fingers itch just holding it. At the top, bold and sharp, it read, "Notice of violation. Unauthorized musical display." Below that was a block of text so formal it barely felt human. I scanned it once, then again, certain I must have read it wrong. The words blurred together, but one line caught my eye. "Homeowner has engaged in the broadcast of amplified sound from her property during non-approved hours. constituting a disturbance of community peace and a breach of HOA Regulation 7.2b. Then the part that made me sit down on my porch step to keep from shaking. Fine. $250, payable within 7 days. $250. For playing holiday music. For sharing something that had brought this neighborhood joy for years. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, half from anger, half from humiliation. My mind flashed to Richard, his tidy hair and his perfect posture at those HOA meetings, talking about protecting the value of our neighborhood. This was his doing, his tidy little crusade against joy. Dana found me sitting there a few minutes later, the letter trembling in my hands. "Oh, Sarah," she said softly, reading over my shoulder. "He actually fined you?" "Apparently," I said, forcing a bitter laugh. "For a crime called music." She frowned. "Can he even do that?" That question sat between us, heavy and real. And that's when I remembered something my husband used to say. When someone tries to scare you with paperwork, read the fine print before you panic. So that's what I did. I took the notice inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and started digging through the HOA bylaws binder I kept from when we first moved in. The thing was the size of a phone book, full of legal jargon and tiny footnotes. It didn't take long to realize something strange. Nowhere, not in any section, did it mention outdoor music, sound equipment, or unauthorized musical displays. Richard had made it up. A quick call to the city clerk confirmed my suspicion. Maple Ridge fell under the jurisdiction of Oak County, and the county's noise ordinance didn't prohibit residential music until after 10 p.m. My speakers had been off by 9:15 every night. In other words, HOAs can't override city or county ordinances. They can't invent rules that contradict local law. Richard either didn't know that, or worse, he didn't care. By noon, the news had already spread down the block. HOA gossip moves faster than wildfire, and Maple Ridge was no exception. Some neighbors stopped waving. Others avoided eye contact altogether. You could feel the fear traveling from house to house, the kind that seeps into people when they realize they could be next. That night, when I stepped outside to check the lights, the air felt different. Charged, cautious. The music had stopped, but the silence had weight. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson pulled her blinds shut as soon as I looked her way. The same woman who used to bring over sugar cookies was now pretending I didn't exist. I sat on the porch steps, clutching the violation letter, trying to decide what to do. The logical part of me said to pay the fine, apologize, keep my head down. But another part, the part that still believed in standing up for something, whispered that if I gave in now, I'd never stop bending. I thought about Michael again, how he used to tell me I had a fire in me that could melt the snow on our roof. Maybe that's why I'd married him, because he saw that spark when I didn't. I closed my eyes, hearing the phantom sound of last week's music still echoing faintly in the cold air, and I knew paying that fine would mean killing the last piece of myself that still believed in joy. So I didn't pay. The next day, another envelope arrived. This one thinner, typed in the same stiff language, but with something new that made my heart skip. Continued non-compliance may result in further fines and potential legal action. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I didn't tear it open this time. I just smiled, a tired, defiant kind of smile. Because deep down, I understood it now. This wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about control. And when the next notice came, the one that fined me again, this time for caroling, that's when I finally knew it wasn't about rules anymore. It was a war. If power had a scent, Richard Coleman wore it like cologne. The first time he came to my door, I smelled it before I even opened it. Sharp, synthetic, lingering. It was a cold Thursday, the kind of air that cracked your breath. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, braced myself, and opened the door. There he was. Pressed blazer, polished shoes, clipboard in hand. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," he said smoothly. "I wanted to address your ongoing non-compliance before we're forced to escalate." His tone was calm, every word precise. Behind him, two neighbors hovered nearby, pretending to water frozen plants. Richard always made sure his performances had witnesses. Non-compliance? I said. Richard, it's Christmas music, not a crime. He tilted his head, pen tapping the clipboard like a ticking clock. Sarah, we have rules for a reason. When one person refuses, it affects everyone. He stepped closer, close enough for me to smell his aftershave, cedar and metal. We've issued 2 violation notices, he continued. If payment isn't received, the board will pursue collection. I stared at him. Over music? Over defiance, he corrected, smiling that politician's smile, lips tight, eyes empty. My pulse thundered. He wasn't protecting property values, he was feeding on control. Across the street, Dana stepped onto her porch, watching. Richard noticed. His voice rose, carrying for his audience. This could all be avoided if you respected the community's leadership. Leadership. His favorite word. I wanted to slam the door. Instead, I reached for my phone and quietly hit record. Michael used to say people like Richard always reveal themselves when they think you won't fight back. Is this visit part of an official HOA action? I asked evenly. Because I thought enforcement discussions had to happen during board meetings. A flicker crossed his face, irritation. Those meetings, he said, are handled internally. That was confirmation enough. HOA boards are required to hold open meetings, with minutes available to homeowners. But under Richard, everything happened behind closed doors. His executive sessions. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You really should be careful about challenging me, Sarah, he murmured. You don't want this to get unpleasant. Unpleasant. The word hung like frost in the air. Are you threatening me? I asked. He smiled faintly. Of course not. Just friendly advice. Then he turned and walked away, shoes crunching the snow, waving to the onlookers like a man signing off a show. When the door clicked shut, I leaned my forehead against the wood, hands trembling, not with fear, but fury. He thought kindness was weakness. He'd just made the worst mistake of his life. That night, Dana came over with cocoa, eyes dark with worry. He's been doing this to others, she whispered, glancing at my phone onto the table. My pulse jumped. What do you mean? She hesitated. I mean, she said quietly, you're not the first person he's tried to break. By January, Maple Ridge didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a stage, and Richard Coleman was the director, pulling strings from behind manicured hedges. The cheerful block I once knew, the one where neighbors brought casseroles and children built snowmen in each other's yards, had turned into a patchwork of suspicion and whispers. You could feel it in the way people paused mid-wave, the way they crossed the street instead of walking past my house. It started on the neighborhood Facebook group, where Richard posted what he called an informational update. It was a wall of text, wrapped in polite phrases, but dripping with accusation. Certain homeowners, he wrote, continue to disrupt community harmony through non-compliant behavior. We encourage all residents to respect the rules that keep Maple Ridge beautiful. He didn't name me, but he didn't have to. The comments section took care of that. By the next morning, my name was everywhere. People debating, speculating, condemning. One comment read, she's always been dramatic. Maybe she just wants attention. Another said, rules are rules. Why should she get special treatment? I stopped reading after that. It was like watching strangers paint over my reputation with colors I didn't recognize. The worst part wasn't the public shaming, it was the silence. Friends I'd known for years avoided eye contact at the mailbox. Parents who once brought their kids to my music classes suddenly found excuses to keep them home. Even the Hendersons, the couple who used to host block parties, pretended they didn't see me when I waved. The sense of community I'd once cherished was rotting from the inside, and Richard had handed everyone the brush to paint me as the villain. One evening, I stood by the window, watching the snow gather on the empty sidewalks. The lights in my yard still glowed faintly, though I'd kept the music off since the police visit. My reflection in the glass looked tired, older somehow. I wondered if Michael would even recognize me now. this version of myself constantly bracing for the next blow. That's when I heard the knock. 3 slow raps, deliberate, familiar. When I opened the door, I found Tommy Reeves standing there with his old police jacket zipped to his chin and a sympathetic half smile. Tommy was a retired officer who'd lived 2 houses down for 20 years. He'd always been the kind of man who called everyone kid, even if you were 35. "Evening, Sarah," he said, brushing snow off his shoulders. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" I stepped aside, grateful for company that didn't come with judgment. He looked around the living room, taking in the darkened tree and the unopened mail piled on the table. "He's making it personal now, isn't he?" he said quietly. I nodded. "It's like he's turning everyone against me. I can't even go to the grocery store without someone pretending to check their phone." Tommy sighed. "That's what control looks like. Seen it 100 times. Guys like Coleman crave order because they can't handle power without it." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and set it on the table. "You've been reading those HOA notices, right? All the fine print?" "Every word," I said. "None of it makes sense." "Then read the bylaws," he said, tapping the paper. "The real ones, not the edited versions they send out in newsletters. HOAs are supposed to enforce their rules equally. They can't pick and choose who gets punished and who doesn't. If he's letting others slide, and I'll bet he is, that's a violation of the fair enforcement doctrine." His words hit me like a jolt. Legal nugget or not, it felt like oxygen after weeks of suffocation. I'd been so caught up in defending myself that I hadn't considered turning his own rules against him. "So if I can prove he's been selective," Tommy nodded, "then he's not enforcing the bylaws. He's abusing them. And that means he's got something to hide." We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the hum of the heater and the wind brushing against the windows. Outside, Richard's house stood in perfect symmetry. Identical wreaths, identical lights, the kind of perfection that looked sterile instead of beautiful. I stared at it, anger flickering back to life. "He's been running the board meetings privately," I said. "No minutes, no homeowner attendance allowed." Tommy gave a low whistle. "That's illegal in most counties. Open meeting laws require transparency. I can check the county records, see if they've filed any recent reports. If there's something off, we'll find it." Something about the way he said we made me feel stronger, less alone. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing. I watched as Tommy gathered his papers, his breath fogging in the cold air as he stepped back onto the porch. "Get some rest, kid," he said. "Tomorrow I'll dig around the county archive. If I find what I think I'll find, Coleman's got more to worry about than Christmas music." I stood in the doorway long after he left, the snow swirling around the streetlights like glitter in a shaken globe. Somewhere deep in my chest, hope flickered again. Maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe I wasn't beaten. And when Tommy called me the next afternoon, his voice low and urgent, I knew the tide was turning. "Sarah," he said, "I found something buried in the county records. And it could destroy Richard." The next morning, I woke up to a message from Tommy. "Meet me at the diner. Bring your coffee strong." The words buzzed with purpose, not fear, but fight. The kind that pushes you out of bed before the ETS alarm. Outside, the snow on Maple Ridge glittered like a promise. Tommy was waiting in our corner booth, papers spread across the table, his glasses low on his nose. "You were right," he said, sliding a sheet toward me. "Coleman's been moving money." I scanned the page, the HOA's quarterly report. 4 payments of $4,800 each, all labeled landscaping maintenance. All to the same vendor, Coleman Property Services. My stomach dropped. "That's his company?" "Technically, his wife's," Tommy said. "But it's him. No board votes, no bids, just his signature." I stared at Richard's neat handwriting. The man who fined me for Christmas music had been stealing from all of us. The hypocrisy burned. "So he's not just controlling," I said quietly. "He's corrupt." Tommy nodded. "If the county sees this, he's done." The diner hummed with ordinary sounds, clinking cups, soft chatter. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady again. I wasn't just surviving him anymore. I was ready to fight. I'm done waiting, I said, leaning forward. It's time I go after him. Good, Tommy said. But be smart. Men like Coleman don't go down easy. That afternoon, I spread the papers across my dining table. Dates, signatures, payments, all roads led to Richard. Dana came by in her scrubs, eyes wide as she took in the evidence. He's been stealing from us? I nodded. In covering it with his own rules. You can't let him get away with this. I won't. That night, under the soft glow of my Christmas tree, I drafted a complaint to the county oversight office. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Richard had power and allies. This could turn ugly, but backing down wasn't an option anymore. I glanced at Michael's photo on the mantel. You'd tell me to finish what I started, I whispered, and for once I believed I could. By midnight, the letter was ready. I planned to file it in the morning, but fate moved first. Headlights flooded my driveway. Tires crunched in the snow. I peeked through the blinds and froze. A sheriff's car sat idling outside, and stepping out of the passenger seat, wearing that same smug smile beneath his polished coat, was Richard Coleman. The knock on the door came just after sunset, slow, deliberate, and heavy enough to make my heart race. I'd been expecting something, but not this. When I looked through the window and saw the county sheriff's vehicle in my driveway, my stomach dropped. The flashing amber lights bounced off the snowbanks, painting my front porch in streaks of gold and red. For a moment, I considered not opening the door at all. But then I saw him. Richard Coleman, standing there beside the deputy like a proud lawyer about to win a case he'd fabricated himself. His gloved hands were folded neatly in front of him, his expression calm, patient, confident. The sheriff held a manila envelope in one hand, and the second I saw the HOA letterhead through the transparent sleeve, I knew exactly what it was. I took a breath and opened the door. "Evening, ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice cautious. "I've been asked to deliver this cease and desist order from your homeowners association." I forced a smile, though my chest felt tight. A cease and desist order? For what? Playing Christmas music? The sheriff hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "They claim ongoing disturbance of community peace. I'm not here to enforce it, just to deliver it." Richard stepped forward, the faint smell of his cologne cutting through the winter air like poison. "This is the final warning, Sarah," he said, his tone measured, almost gentle. "If you continue disregarding HOA regulations, we'll have no choice but to pursue further action." I wanted to scream, but my voice refused to cooperate. I glanced down at the document. 5 neatly typed paragraphs, full of phrases like non-compliance, disturbance, failure to adhere to Section 9B. At the bottom, that same infuriating signature, Richard L. Coleman, President. The sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly. "Just so you understand, ma'am," he said quietly, "this isn't a legal order. Homeowners associations can't enforce criminal actions. It's not a police matter." That was the moment something inside me shifted. He didn't have to say it twice. Richard's entire act, the officers, the paperwork, the formal tone, it was theater. He wasn't enforcing the law. He was pretending to. HOAs can't send sheriffs to your door and claim legal authority. The most they can do is file civil complaints. But Richard wanted fear, not fairness. He wanted a show, and for a few seconds, he almost got it. I felt the heat rise in my face. Humiliation, anger, grief, everything crashing together until I could barely breathe. The man who stole Christmas from my family was now using law enforcement as his puppets. Behind him, a few neighbors stood by their fences pretending to shovel snow. Watching. Always watching. "Is that all?" I asked quietly, refusing to look away. Richard's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. "For now," he said, slipping his gloves back on, "but I'd suggest you think carefully about your next move." I watched as the sheriff gave an apologetic nod and returned to his car. Richard lingered for a second longer, then turned to leave, his shoes crunching rhythmically against the ice. Every step he took away from my porch felt like a taunt. A man so certain of his own power that he didn't even bother to look back. When he was gone, I shut the door and leaned against it, the wood cool against my back. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The humiliation burned like frostbite, not because he'd won, but because I'd let him make me feel powerless. That's what men like Richard thrived on, the silence that follows shame. But as I stared at the document in my hand, the shaking stopped. My pulse slowed. My breath steadied. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, something new began to take shape. Resolve. I walked into the living room and laid the so-called order on the table beside Tommy's paperwork. The evidence of Richard's misuse of funds, his false signatures, his corruption. I looked at both documents side by side and realized how fragile his empire really was. Everything he'd built rested on intimidation and secrecy, but the second I dragged his deeds into the light, he'd crumble. I sat down at my desk, flipping open my laptop. The cursor blinked against the empty email draft like a challenge. My fingers hovered over the keys, and a plan began to take form. One that was lawful, public, and impossible for him to silence. I wouldn't just expose him. I'd humiliate him the way he humiliated me, in front of the entire neighborhood, the whole county, if I had to. The idea came like a spark, small at first, then bright and blinding. Something loud, something joyful, something so purely defiant that he could never twist it into wrongdoing. And as I sat there, the echo of the sheriff's boots fading from my memory, I whispered to myself, if he wants to control silence, then I'll fight him with sound. I picked up my phone, my hand steady for the first time in weeks. My thumb hovered over a familiar contact. Someone who could make this idea come alive. It started with a single phone call to the high school band director. When I dialed the number, my hand trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Maple Ridge High, band department. This is Mark. It had been years since I'd spoken to Mark Delaney, the band director I used to volunteer for before Michael's accident. He was the kind of man who believed music could fix almost anything. Mark, it's Sarah Whitmore, I said. I need to ask you something. Unusual. I told him everything. Richard Coleman, the fines, the threats, the silence he'd forced on our neighborhood. Mark didn't hesitate long. So he wants silence? He said with a laugh. Then let's give him music he'll never forget. And just like that, the Maple Ridge Holiday March was born. The plan, a fully permitted holiday parade down the public streets. Marching band, carolers, floats. Legal, unstoppable. City permits override HOA rules on public roads, and once the ink dried, Richard's power meant nothing. The next morning, I filed the paperwork myself. Margaret, the city clerk, smiled as she stamped the approval. Let's bring some joy back to Maple Ridge, she said. I walked out clutching that permit like a flag. For the first time in months, I felt tall again. Over the next 2 weeks, the town came alive. Mark gathered 60 students, drums, trumpets, clarinets, even a tuba section that could rattle windows. They practiced in the cold, breath clouding the night air. Dana was my right hand, going door to door. You don't have to march, she told the neighbors. Just stand outside and clap. Tommy handled the logistics, confirming the parade route was fully public. They can glare all they want, he said, but they can't touch you. Word spread like wildfire. Parents dusted off Santa hats, kids rehearsed carols, shop owners offered lights and cookies. Fear melted into something stronger. Quiet rebellion. Maple Ridge, once ruled by intimidation, was waking up. Richard just didn't know it yet. The night before the parade, I stood in my yard staring at the snow-covered street that would soon come alive with sound. The same street where he'd once made me unplug my speakers. Snow drifted down softly, peaceful, defiant. Dana looked up from wrapping lights around my mailbox. You think he'll try to stop us? She smiled. He can try, but tomorrow the silence ends. Inside, my phone buzzed. A message from Mark. We're ready. 9 a.m. sharp. I smiled at the street that had been my prison and my home. Ready? I whispered. I've been ready since the night they cut the power. Because this wasn't just a parade anymore. It was a declaration that joy can't be outlawed, no matter how many rules you write. And by the time Richard found out, it was already too late. The first drumbeat cracked through the morning air like thunder over snow. Deep, alive, a heartbeat Maple Ridge hadn't felt in years. The marching band turned the corner in perfect formation, red and gold uniforms gleaming under the winter sun. Trumpets followed, fearless and bright, slicing through the cold. For a moment, I just stood at the head of the procession, my gloved hands trembling as the music wrapped around me. One by one, neighbors stepped outside, hesitant, then smiling, waving, clapping. Children jumped in the snow. Dana's son, Ethan, marched proudly beside the drummers, his Santa hat bouncing with every beat. It was everything I'd dreamed of. And everything Richard Coleman feared. The band reached the center of Maple Ridge Drive, right in front of Richard's pristine home. His curtains flew open, then, his door, and there he was. Red-faced, furious, robe flying like a flag of outrage. "Stop this! Stop this now!" he shouted, voice cracking against the brass. The band didn't stop. They played louder. I stepped forward, holding the rolled-up permit like a declaration. "Actually," I said, smiling, "this parade is fully authorized by the city. Public street, public permit." The officer beside me, the same deputy who once delivered Richard's bogus cease and desist, checked the document and nodded. "She's right. City permit number 4729. Everything's in order." Cheers erupted. Laughter, applause, the kind that shakes loose months of fear. Richard's next words vanished beneath the roar. For the first time, he looked small, powerless, swallowed by the very sound he'd tried to silence. Across the crowd, Dana met my eyes and mouthed, "You did it." But it wasn't just me. It was every neighbor he'd bullied, every voice he'd tried to quiet. The music swelled, fierce and free. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but release. Richard stood frozen, lost in the noise, a child's candy cane waving past his face like mockery. When the last note of "O Holy Night" soared, I lifted my hand high and let my voice join the cheers. For the first time since Michael died, I felt truly alive. Not because I'd beaten him, but because I'd reclaimed something he could never touch. My spirit. When the music faded, neighbors hugged, laughed, cried. Even the Hendersons, who'd avoided me for months, brought cocoa and quiet apologies. Richard said nothing. He turned, pale, and disappeared into his house, slamming the door. I stood in the street, breathing in the cold air that finally felt warm again. Maple Ridge pulsed with life. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because the story didn't end when the music stopped. The parade was supposed to be the ending, the triumphant close to a story that had dragged on too long. But in the days that followed, it became something bigger than I ever imagined. By that night, videos of the Maple Ridge Holiday March had flooded social media. Someone had filmed Richard shouting in the middle of the street while a band of teenagers played "O Holy Night" behind him, and it spread like wildfire. The caption read, "HOA tries to stop Christmas, gets drowned out by joy." By morning, it had over 200,000 views. Reporters started calling the city office, then my school, then me. I didn't answer at first. I was too tired, too overwhelmed, too wary of turning something pure into another spectacle. But every headline told the same story. Widowed teacher defies HOA tyrant. I wasn't the villain anymore. I was the symbol of resistance. The following week, the city council held a public session to address community governance concerns. It wasn't meant to target anyone by name, but everyone knew who they were talking about. Richard Coleman showed up late, wearing his usual blazer and that same polished arrogance. But this time, there was no confidence behind his smile. Only fear disguised as formality. I sat in the back beside Tommy, clutching a folder full of the financial records he'd uncovered. The city investigator, A calm woman named Maria Sanchez stood at the podium reading from her report. Her voice echoed through the room. Our review of Maple Ridge Estates HOA accounts reveals unauthorized expenditures totaling over $21,000 across a period of 18 months, all signed by President Richard L. Coleman. You could feel the air leave the room. Richard shifted in his seat, jaw tight, his face turning the same shade as his tie. Those were legitimate maintenance expenses, he muttered, but no one was listening. Maria continued, listing payments to Coleman Property Services and Coleman Holdings LLC. Every word cut deeper. When she finished, she looked up and said plainly, "Mr. Coleman, you were required by law to disclose conflicts of interest involving financial gain. You did not." A murmur spread through the audience. Homeowners, board members, even Richard's allies whispering among themselves. One of them, a tall man named Brent who'd always stood by Richard at every meeting, quietly got up and slipped out of the room. Another followed. They were already jumping ship. Tommy leaned over and whispered, "They're running before the fire spreads." I wanted to feel joy, triumph, something, but all I felt was tired. It wasn't the exhaustion of defeat. It was the kind that comes after carrying a burden for too long and finally setting it down. Justice wasn't as loud as I thought it would be. It didn't roar. It sighed. After the meeting, reporters crowded around me. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you know about the financial misconduct? Do you plan to sue the HOA? How does it feel to have the whole city behind you?" I smiled politely, but my words came out slow, measured. "It's not about winning," I said. "It's about reminding people that no one, not even a homeowners association, is above the law." That night, I walked home to a street that finally felt alive again. The lights twinkled softly, neighbors waved, and someone even started playing Christmas music from a Bluetooth speaker. I didn't know who, and it didn't matter. The silence had been broken for good. I sat by my window with a mug of cocoa, watching snow fall over Maple Ridge. Dana texted me a picture of Richard's house, dark, unlit, curtains drawn. She added one line, "Guess he doesn't like the sound of freedom." I should have been at peace. The investigation confirmed everything. The city had taken over HOA oversight, and Richard's so-called empire was crumbling. For the first time in months, I felt safe enough to breathe. But peace has a way of vanishing just when you start believing in it. 3 days later, as I sorted through the last of the parade donations, I heard another knock at the door. Softer this time, but somehow heavier. When I opened it, a man in a dark coat handed me a thick envelope. "Sarah Whitmore?" he asked. "Yes," he nodded. "You've been served." I looked down at the document in my hands. The bold letters on the front made my blood run cold. Subpoena. I thought it was over, until the subpoena arrived. The courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and cold air, a blend of nerves and truth waiting to surface. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors who'd come to watch, their whispers fading as the clerk called the case. Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association versus Sarah Whitmore. It wasn't truly me on trial, not this time, but it felt that way. Across the aisle, Richard Coleman sat rigid in his chair, his blazer crisp, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. He still carried himself like a man in control, but the tremor in his hands gave him away. For the first time, there was no audience he could manipulate, no neighborhood to intimidate. Just a judge, a stack of evidence, and the truth. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my heart pounding but steady. "Your Honor," I began, "this isn't about fines or music or decorations. This is about one man using power to silence others." I held up the printed records Tommy had uncovered, the fake landscaping contracts, the forged signatures, the unauthorized transfers. Each page was a piece of the mask Richard had worn, and with every word I spoke, it cracked a little more. The judge flipped through the documents, her brow furrowing deeper with each line. "Mr. Coleman," she said finally, her voice calm but cutting, "can you explain these payments to your personal companies?" Richard stammered. His voice, once so smooth, faltered, under the weight of exposure. "They were necessary expenses," he mumbled, for the benefit of the community. Maria Sanchez, the city investigator, stood and spoke firmly. The city's audit confirms these expenses were fraudulent. Mr. Coleman diverted HOA funds for personal use. We recommend immediate removal of the current board and temporary city oversight. A ripple of gasps moved through the room. Richard's shoulders sagged, his pen slipping from his hand and clattering onto the table. The judge nodded. Effective immediately, the Maple Ridge Estates HOA board is dissolved. City management will assume control pending reorganization. Relief flooded through me. Not joy, just release. I'd expected triumph, but what I felt instead was peace, heavy and quiet, like a long exhale after months of holding my breath. Justice wasn't revenge, it was balance. As the courtroom emptied, I gathered my papers and turned toward the exit. Richard was already there, standing in the doorway. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then his voice came low, stripped of arrogance. "I was wrong," he said. And for the first time, I believed him. The first snow of the season fell the night the city dissolved the HOA. It came quietly, blanketing Maple Ridge in soft white, erasing the footprints of everything that had come before. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt earned, peaceful, not fearful. I sat by my living room window, the glow of Christmas lights flickering across the glass, and rested my hands on the piano keys. When I pressed down, the sound filled the house like a heartbeat returning after too long gone. The melody was slow, tender, the same song Michael used to play when we decorated the tree together. I hadn't touched this piano since the night the HOA shut off my power, but now, every note felt like a reclamation. Outside, I heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow. When I looked up, I saw neighbors gathering along the sidewalk, drawn by the music. Dana stood in her coat and scarf, waving. Tommy was beside her, holding a thermos of cocoa and grinning like a man half his age. Even the Hendersons were there, their porch lit up again for the first time since all this began. One by one, more people emerged, kids, parents, couples, standing in the glow of porch lights, smiling, listening. I opened the window and let the music spill into the cold air. It carried across the street, soft but strong, like an anthem for every person who had been afraid to stand up before. It wasn't loud or defiant this time. It was steady, a song of freedom, of peace, of community finding its way back. As I played, I thought about everything that had happened. The notices, the fines, the humiliation, the endless nights wondering if I was doing the right thing. I thought about how fear spreads when good people stay quiet, and how courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to face it anyway. There's something they never tell you about power. It only works when people believe in it. Once you stop believing, once you learn your rights and see through the bluster, their control dissolves like snow in sunlight. So here's what I learned. If an HOA or anyone else tries to bully you with laws or threats, always check the city ordinances first. HOAs can't overrule public law. They can't police joy. They only have as much power as you hand them. When the last note faded, the crowd outside clapped, some even wiping away tears. I smiled through the window, heart full, knowing this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who'd ever been silenced. I turned back to the piano, running my fingers lightly over the keys. "What would you do?" I whispered, "if your HOA tried to silence your joy?" Because I read every story, every comment, and I know there are more battles like mine out there. Families fighting against people like Richard Coleman, neighborhoods torn apart by greed disguised as governance. This chapter ended with music, but the next one? It begins with a veteran whose HOA tried to evict him for flying the American flag. And trust me, that story will make even Richard look tame.